Peace, what's going on? Welcome back to the No Truths Barred podcast, the best up and coming podcast on the internet, and I'm your host, Hoikaweku Timmons. And listen, this is a brand new year. This is 2021, new beginnings, and I hope that you guys have a good idea of what you want to do, what you want to manifest in this upcoming year, because 2021 is the 5-year numerology. So if you study numerology, then you know that the number 5 is indicative of change and progress and novelty. So be prepared. Be prepared to dig deep and to truly tap into your potential and to truly begin to leave your fingerprint on this world and on society and on your friends and family. I'm so excited for this year. I look forward to a lot of things that I have coming up with this particular platform. I have some great collaborations coming. I have some more things I'm going to be doing on YouTube. I also have a few things I'm going to be doing that are directly correlate with the podcast, but also it'll be a lot more educational in nature as well. So once again, if you've never listened to an episode, my name is Hoikaweku Timmons. I'm the host of the No Truths Barred podcast. This is a podcast based out of Richmond, Virginia. You can find this on Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, YouTube, Stitcher, and Anchor. So I'm available on all of those. So if you don't have one of them, you can find me on the other. Also, if you have not done so already, make sure you're following me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Hoyt, Hoyt underscore Kwaku, Kwaku underscore Timmons, that's Timmons. I also have a brand new page, which is underscore No Truths Barred podcast, and that's on Instagram. And I'm still working to build that page up. And over the next several weeks, I'm going to gradually shift a lot of my content, and soon 100% of my content over on that particular page as well. So once again, thank you for listening. And as always, I always like to thank all of the listeners, everybody who's provided a piece of constructive criticism, feedback, shared a piece of content, shared a flyer when I didn't ask, people who've definitely helped me along the way. I do not take it for granted, and I just really pray, and I'm working hard to take this particular platform to the next level this year. So without further ado, welcome back, and this is episode 56. Episode 56, this is crazy that I'm on my 56th episode, but let's jump into this. Episode 56, America Burning, Apocalypse Yesterday. America Burning, Apocalypse Yesterday. Really quick, I want to read you a quote from one of my favorite scholars by the name of Dr. Noam Chomsky. And he says, the whole educational and professional training system is a very elaborate filter, which just weeds out people who are too independent and who think for themselves and who don't know how to be submissive and so on, because they're too dysfunctional to the institutions. I want to highlight that particular quote because it actually feeds into what I'm going to speak about in this particular podcast episode. And when you look at this particular quote, I want to apply that to our political system. And the way we've been groomed and the way we've been indoctrinated is that we have this dichotomy of politics. We have this biopoly which rules political discourse in this country. So either you're on the left or either you're on the right. And the indoctrination is that outside of those, you have no options. If you go back earlier in my podcast, I actually did an episode where I really critiqued the concepts and the reality of the two-party system. And when you look at the way our schools are set up, so for example, when you look at public schools are not really designed to produce independent thinkers, to produce paradigm-shifting intellectuals. Essentially, what public school systems do is that they're creating a stratification of various types of cogs that fit into the machine. And the machine being the machine of commerce, the machine of, I have a good and I want you to have enough resources to purchase my goods. And once again, this is my caveat. I'm not trying to be anti-capitalist or pro-socialist. I'm just stating a reality. And what our system seeks to do is to have a populace of consumers. So if you're really grooming people to become a populace of consumers, you're not truly worried about people engaged in true political discourse or engaged in ideas that are going to radically shift the concept of what a Democrat is, the concept of what a Republican is, the concept of what a libertarian is. This is the rhetoric. This is what we want you to comprehend. And this is the rhetoric that we want you to regurgitate. Also, standardized tests have that same specific purpose. Standardized tests are remember, regurgitate, remember, regurgitate, remember, regurgitate. It's not really about truly producing intellectuals. Now, I say all of that to say that this presents a problem when we're talking about the arena of politics. Because if you look at society, if we're talking about healthcare, if we're talking about the economy, if we're talking about food deserts in certain urban centers, if we're talking about the shifting demographics of various constituents in whatever district you want to point at, these things are malleable. These things are constantly changing. And if we approach it with this static view of regurgitating or leaning with rhetoric that we've been taught is supposed to be synonymous to what we want, then we truly don't change anything politically. Everything just becomes, wash, rinse, repeat. And if that's the order of the day, then we're not really working towards anything that is going to truly change society. And I think that's what Chomsky is pointing out in this particular quote. So I said America burning apocalypse yesterday. I want to take another quote from another scholar that I really look up to, and I've studied quite a bit of their work, is the botanist, the philosopher by the name of Terence McKenna. If you get a chance, read his book, Archaic Revival, and then the other book is, I cannot remember the name, but it's about the Stone Ape theory, which essentially when he talks about the psychoactive substances and psilocybin mushrooms, how they are embedded in the evolution of the human brain. Essentially, that's kind of the synopsis of it. That's what that particular book is about. But Terence McKenna said something that I felt was really simple, but yet extremely profound. And one of the things that McKenna said is that we in the West, we have the luxury to anticipate the apocalypse because the apocalypse has already happened all over the world. And what I want to point out, I want to take that concept and let's expand that out. And what I would argue is that the apocalypse has already happened dozens of times throughout history. What I would argue is that domestic terrorism has happened dozens and dozens of times throughout this country's history. What I would argue is that the apocalypse, along with /terrorism, happened with old European values interfacing with these societies in the Western Hemisphere, circa 1492. Then let's look at this. Is it the perspective that we're so special, we're so ordained that insurrection, tragedy isn't supposed to befall us? Now, what prompted this particular episode is what happened on January 6th in this nation's capital. I was appalled by it. But it highlighted a lot of things about this country that I think we already knew. It highlighted things that maybe we did not know. And then it highlighted certain things about the hubris that we have as Americans. What I want to say here is that if we're looking at Western civilization, and when I say Western civilization, I'm talking about how societies arose in the Western Hemisphere, which would be North America, Central America, South America, after the coming of Columbus. When we look at Western civilization, the cornerstone of Western civilization is founded on violence, it's founded on conquering, It's founded on rape. It's founded on slavery. I remember Immortal Technique had a song called Sign of the Times. And I'm going to have to paraphrase what Technique said on that particular song. But what Technique said, he said, well, what did he say? He said, I guess the fortune teller skipped the Antichrist or two. And what he was talking about was the Arawak. And if you look at it, when Columbus came, within 50 years of him coming, the population of the Arawak, under which the Tainos would fall, was decimated by at least 75%, almost 80%. And you still do find Arawak and Taino people in pockets around the Caribbean, but the population essentially was decimated for a myriad of reasons. So you had essentially the Tainos had a different paradigm of life. The Arawak had a different paradigm of life. And they were very open and they were very trusting. And what they did when they met Columbus, they saw their humanity. They treated them as people. But Columbus and his men didn't have that same perspective. The perspective they had, they were coming for gold. Now, this is something that I've heard contested. So it's some conflicting sources on this. So you might want to go and do your own research, what I'm about to say. But in one of the letters that Columbus actually wrote back to Spain, in it he talked about how noble the people were. He talked about how giving and kind they were. He talked about how open and how they were willing to share, and how they rarely, if ever, said no to any of the demands of the Spaniards. And in this letter, he said, El gente en Dios. And essentially, he called them people in God or people of God. And then followed that up by saying, with 50 men, we can easily subdue and enslave them. So that's kind of one of the theories where the term Indian comes, because this particular theory states that Columbus knew that he was not in India, and that it actually comes from him saying that these are godly people or people of God or people in God. But then you turn around and you rape, pillage, and kill them. Also, this year, I'm trying to be conscientious of the time. So you see me looking away, I'm just making sure that I'm on time. I want to keep these to an hour and make sure you guys get about your way. But the reason why I want to go all the way back is because a lot of this, it shows this quotidian habit within Western civilization to hand out punishment for those that don't comply with our worldview. So you look at the Arawak. So people, Columbus, what would happen is this, is that if you brought back a certain amount of gold, you would get like a copper bracelet. If you did not have a copper bracelet, you could get your hands amputated. You could actually get your head decapitated, in which both ways will ultimately lead towards death. Spaniards would test the sharpness of their swords by cutting into the flesh of the indigenous people. And then it got so bad that a lot of families and mothers, what they would do, they were starting to kill their own children because they felt that death was a better alternative as opposed to dealing with the Spaniards. And, pardon me, the way that we found all of this out is through the writings of Bartolomé de las Casas. And he wrote a book called A Short History of the Destruction of the Indies. And what de las Casas reported was a lot of atrocities. And de las Casas himself actually had an encomienda, which was like essentially like a small plantation or patch of land where he had people that were enslaved working for him and laboring and toiling for him. But essentially he stepped away from that. But one of the things about de las Casas that was extraordinary, now, the slave trade to Africa really started with the Portuguese, and that goes to 1441. So one of the first small amount of Africans that made their way to Portugal would have been from Mauritania. And then later on in 1441, 1442, the Portuguese via Henry the Navigator would have made their way to the Congo. And so that was like one of the oldest interactions between Western Europe and West Africa as far as the slave trade goes. And when you study that, you start to kind of see how the naissance of what we would consider race kind of begin to develop. Although the ossified classifications that we have now wouldn't come till later on. So we have a propensity to look at terror, to look at insurrection, to look at terrorism from an Anglo-Saxon based lens. Now, I want you to follow me because I'm working towards something here. That's the way we primarily view terrorism. Now, these groups that were decimated, we look at them as being, well, they were not as advanced. Mind you, these people had astronomy, extremely complex cosmology, sanitary habits, medicinal knowledge, right? That would rival their European counterparts. Because a lot of times, if you look at the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the people that were on those boats were people that weren't of the aristocracy. They weren't of the landed class. And even here in Virginia, when you look at the Virginia Royal Company that was sending people over, a lot of times these people were, surplus citizens, vagrants, debtors, prostitutes, criminals that were coming over here. Matter of fact, John Hakluyt, the way he looked at Virginia, the way that the aristocracy looked at Virginia initially, is that it was supposed to be a dumping ground for England's poor. It was supposed to be a dumping ground for England's disenfranchised. That's the way they originally look at it, as a dumpster can to dump off the people that they did not want there. And that's how we have to begin to understand these dynamics that produce the world that we currently live in. So you're looking at that. Well, that's one thing. You look at the Aztec Empire or the Mexicano Empire or the Mexica Empire, that's what they were called, or the Triple Alliance, which was Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec Empire, Texcoco, and then I think it was Lapacan, which was the other little city-state that together formed the power that would have been known as the Aztec Empire. And at the time of Hernando Cortez, the ruler would have been Moctezuma II. If you look at the Inca, the ruler there was, I cannot remember the name. It was Atahalpa, Atahaulpa. I think either the first or the second. I apologize. Maybe I need to start writing stuff down with these podcasts. But essentially, he was the ruler of the Inca Empire. That empire was conquered by Francisco Pizarro. The Aztecs were brought down by Hernando Cortez. And in each one of these cases, from the perspective of the Aztecs, although some would argue that, oh, you guys here now, it's Saturday evening. When you might be listening to this Monday, but it's Saturday. It's beautiful out here. I want to have the windows up, and you'll be able to see this on YouTube as well. But when you look at, lost my train of thought. But anyway, when you look at that, the perspective of the Aztecs, although some scholars argue that Moctezuma and some of the Aztecs may have saw Cortez as the return of Quetzalcoatl, which was a deity that came and apparently bestowed the knowledge of farming and education and writing and astronomy amongst the Aztecs. And that particular deity is built on the mythos of an earlier deity amongst the Maya by the name of Kublai Khan. So that was one of the theories or ideas that certain scholars have put out there. And they said that may have been why Cortez was so easily able to get to the Aztec capital and actually get court with Moctezuma II. I don't think that's necessarily the case. But that's for a different episode. I don't want to really go too deep into that. But primarily what I want to inculcate is that according to these people, to their worldview and their paradigm, they went through the apocalypse. They met the insurrection. But yet, we can look at Columbus as a hero. But yet, we can look at Hernando Cortez as a brave traveler and explorer. But yet, we can look at Francisco Pizarro, who took the Inca, and actually the Inca it refers to the king, not the empire. The king was called the Inca. They took the king for ransom and held him hostage to take over amongst the Inca to take over the empire. And so according to these people, they met the apocalypse. They didn't need the book of Revelation. They didn't need a preacher to come to them. They had it. But according to us, when we study history as Americans of Western civilization, it's like we have this hubris that is supposed to happen to those people and not us. We don't have insurrection. We don't have an apocalypse. We don't have famine. We don't have plague. That happened to those people back then or over there, not us. And that's why when I see certain things that went on, I kind of have to laugh. Let me check the time. All right, making sure I'm good here. Okay. But the but it's just so surprising to me the way terror, whether it's like I said, via the Spaniards and the Portuguese, or if you want to look at the British here in Virginia and their actions amongst the Powhatan Confederacy here in VA, and various other Algonquin-speaking natives, in North Carolina, Virginia, all the way up the Eastern Seaboard. And if you read Charles C. Mann's work, he talks about how just on the eve of Columbus, and also, not to digress, a lot of times when we think about the slave trade or the advent of the slave trade here in the what would become the United States, we think about 1619. But for a brief period in 1556, the Spaniards actually had a small colony, I believe, either in Chesapeake or what would be modern day North Carolina, with a small amount of Africans. It didn't last very long, enough to make a significant impact, but technically, although we don't recognize that would have predated the 1619 date in which the White Lion, the ship holding 20 some odd Negroes that landed in Point Comfort or Fort Comfort, which is modern day Hampton Roads. But I just kind of wanted to point that out. But speaking of that, another form of domestic terrorism, which gets a little bit more complex, that we don't look at it that way. Now, keep in mind, this whole concept of African kingdoms just being overran and taken over by the Dutch or the English or the Spaniards or the Portuguese is not true. That would not have came until almost 300 years after the first initial ships that engaged in the commerce of human cargo. That wouldn't have happened for centuries until after that. What you would have had, for example, like the Portuguese in, I believe in the 1450s, the Portuguese would have established Elmina off of the coast of Ghana. And Elmina initially was about gold. And that's why I had the name for that. It was about gold, but it began to become one of the first slave castles, along with Gorée Island off of the coast of Senegal, which is known as the point of no return, or the door of no return. But essentially, that's why the Portuguese were in Ghana, because of that. And what had to happen is that you had European forts that would get conquered, held for ransom by African kingdoms. They really had to acquiesce for centuries. They could not really go and push inland. Now, yeah, you had different instances Well, I think what's the guy that they always talk about with the good ship Jesus, and I can't remember his name. I don't know if it's John Henry. I can't remember the name. I apologize. But essentially, he would have went into like the Senegambian area, and I want to remember his name, but I apologize. But essentially, he would have went into the Senegambian, and he had like some skirmishes where he might have went in and captured some people, but he was defeated the second time he tried to do that. So that really wasn't feasible for these different European merchants that would go to Africa to try to deal in the commerce of human cargo. But what the slave trade did to Africa is that I liken the slave trade to the crack cocaine epidemic that hit Black America. Is that what it did was that a lot of the goods like cloth, a lot of metals that you could get in Europe, you actually could get the same thing in Africa. What Europe did was that they were able to mass produce and make more of it at a cheaper price than they could in Africa. Because if you look at Africa, you would have really large, complex societies and then many, many miniature, less advanced societies that inhabit these various coastal regions. And so you didn't really have a hegemonous, massive society that could, like, for example, to say that, we're the British or we're the Dutch. You would have had a lot of varying kingdoms. And later on, with the advent of the slave trade, you would have like stuff like the Oyo Empire, the Ashanti Empire, and Dongo. You would have had the Jollof Empire. These different empires you would have, but the west coast of Africa, from the Bight of Benin, up through the Senegambian, you're talking about so many different diverse people. So the interactions would have been a lot different versus how you would have interacted, let's say, with the Aztecs, which was kind of one hegemonous group with, different subsects within that. But my point is, and I know people ask, why are you going back over all this history? My point being is that when we look back at these peoples, and I never forget the past, when we look back, we have a perspective of they were weak, they got conquered. We don't look at it as they experienced terrorism. We don't look at it as they were victims. We don't look at it that way. And let me stump an argument out really quick too. Let me stump this particular argument out. The argument that somebody will put up is like, well, Africans sold other Africans. Remember what I said earlier. You had different groups. So, for example, Vikings in Europe would sell people off of the coast of the British Isles, parts of Gaul, which is modern-day France, over into Italy to Normans. They would sell other white people into slavery in North Africa. Actually, you can find certain Viking burial sites that have stitchings of Arabic and references to Allah and the Prophet of Muhammad, because the Vikings had such an intimate commerce with North Africa and these different groups that would have been Muslims that would have been inhabiting Northern Africa. Whether you're talking about like these Berber people, which the Tamashek, which would have been so diverse across Northern Africa, various other groups like the Mori Mazikes in Tripoli, that were engaged in this sort of commerce around the Mediterranean involving white cargo. Now, the dynamics for the slave trade in Northern Africa and Europe were far different than the dynamics that would have happened in the Western Hemisphere. Far different. But what my point is that in that time, those Africans would have looked at it the way of phenotypically, the Viking and the Anglo-Saxon looks alike, but culturally they're different. Same way, phenotypically, a Serer and a Wolof person may look alike, but culturally they're different. Phenotypically, an Igbo and a Yoruba would look alike, but culturally they're different. So you may not have looked at it like you were selling your own people. And once again, I'm gonna do a podcast about the complexities of the slave trade. I'm really gonna focus on that period of between 1441 and 1550, because I want people to truly get an education and to understand the dynamics of how it worked. My point being here, I just want to highlight that we did not look at those peoples as victims, nor did we how we looked at the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. We did not look at those people as victims. We didn't. All right, I'm doing good on my time. So it's so let's take it a step further, a little bit more recent. So let's look at the domestic slave trade, which happened after 1807, when the importation of Africans became illegal. What started to happen was that Virginia, specifically Richmond and Alexandria. Richmond was founded in 1780. Can't remember when Alexandria was founded, but Richmond actually was a part of Henrico Shire. So you had this big mass of land, which was Henrico Shire, and out of it, Richmond was drawn up and became the new capital of the state of Virginia since about 1780 up until now. Richmond's been the capital of the state of Virginia. And when you look at Virginia and you look at Richmond being a hub, and actually there was a term that was called being sold down the river. And when you look at slavery here in Virginia was a lot different than other parts of the South, because you had a lot of urban centers here. And then you had, like, for example, you had people that were enslaved that could hire out their time. So you may have like a person that might be like kind of like a small yeoman farmer, or may be able to only afford 1 or 2 or 3 slaves. And to make money, they would hire their slaves out. Sorry. Just thought I saw something crazy. But you have people that would hire their slaves out. So it was a little bit different. So in order to kind of instill fear and not have slaves run away, you would be threatened to get sold down the river down south to where the conditions were far harsher than they were here. That was the truth. That was the truth of the matter. So you would get threatened to get sold down south away from your family. And here in Richmond, for example, slaves, you might be forced to sleep in an attic, under a porch, sometimes on the ground beside a tree. You kind of were treated like an animal. And another misconception that we have about slavery is the whole naming thing. You were a piece of property. You were an animal. You did not have a name. So for example, let's say if I was enslaved and one slave owner called me John, I might get sold, and then the other one might call me Boy, or maybe some days he'll feel like calling me Tom or Edward, and I would have to answer to that or get beat. And maybe 3 other people might be named Edward, and when they would call us or call one of us, all of us would like run and be on edge of that attention, because if we don't respond, severe punitive action can be taken against us. So you were an animal. You know, sometimes you might have clothes, sometimes you might have to work naked. There were plantations where you come and people are just naked. Or you might get some sack of clothing to wear. I mean, the barbarity of it is beyond what we can imagine. Like I said, I'm going to do a podcast really going in on that. And you didn't have a last name. And a lot of times as slavery ended, if you did get a last name, like a lot of black people would choose a name like Jefferson or Washington after somebody famous. But another reason that black people, not because they had a slave mentality, but you took the name of the plantation owner in hopes of finding your family, or hope that your family could find you. So let's say if I'm on the Timmons plantation and I want my family to find me, then they can know, like, well, let's say I'm Jim. Jim was on the Timmons plantation, so I'll be Jim Timmons. And hopefully if my sister or my brother or my child got sold over here, they would know, like, okay, well, a Timmons is here. And so I can maybe like link and find my people. That was like one of the reasons that it was done as well. because you were property, you were an animal. They did not think enough of you to give you a last name. So that's one of the things. It's a lot, like I said, with slavery. But this is another form of brutality, of terrorism, but we don't care because it's not Anglo-Saxon based. So we don't really care about it. So let's take it to 1866, the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, where the Ku Klux Klan started by Nathan Bedford Forrest, a former Confederate general, and other former soldiers of the Confederacy. They worked at the behest of the Democratic Party to suppress the votes of black people, to terrorize you against going out to vote. And just around that time period, the federal government removed the Freedmen's Bureau, so there was really no protection of black people in southern states to protect them or guarantee the things that were supposed to be given to them after emancipation. So now you're in an environment where there's kind of like a license to kill and a green light on black people now. And the Ku Klux Klan took that to a different level. Let me tell you something interesting. A few years ago when I was in college, I actually took a Homeland Security course. And I think it was my 102 course. In my 102 course, there was a list of people that were considered domestic terrorists. And so they had abortion groups. They had like black nationalist groups, for example. So like the Hebrew Israelites and a few other groups on there. And then a few other different miscellaneous groups that I actually never heard of. And the funny thing I noticed, and this caused a huge debate in class, was that the Ku Klux Klan was not listed as a domestic terrorist organization according to the FBI. When they were listed, when all of these different groups were listed, the Ku Klux Klan was not up there. And what it told me on a deeper level is that the terrorism inflicted against black people does not matter because it doesn't affect mainstream America. And mainstream America is a euphemism for white America. So if it doesn't directly threaten them, despite the fact that black people fought in every war, been here, provided centuries of free labor, etc., been test subjects. Matter of fact, the father of gynecology, J. Marion Sims, tested and performed these crude procedures on black women, would later go on to be, revered as the father of modern gynecology. And that information, that data came from the unethical testing that he did on African women. All of this, all of this that was contributed, and still the Ku Klux Klan is not listed as a domestic terrorist organization. Despite countless lynchings, castrations, burning people alive in front of thousands of spectators, controlling entire police departments. And to take it back further, the origin of the police department in the South, and really in the North as well, was to catch runaways, to catch slaves. 1704 slave patrols in South Carolina were there to catch enslaved Africans. That's how law enforcement started in our country. Let me not digress. Let's talk about Tulsa, Oklahoma, May 31st, 1931.